that he's going to an annual railroad convention, and glad he's getting to do that. So he's missing in action, and John Beasley is going to MC the program tonight, and I'm just making a couple of opening comments. You know, you all have a meeting notice. You know what the meeting is tonight. We get another perspective on Islam tonight, and our speaker for next week is here tonight, Professor Raymond Kessler, and does the Second Amendment protect individuals who are not members of a formal state militia? And, you know, he will present the case to us that it does. I've read an awful lot of articles and pieces about the subject, and I agree with the position he's taking. Yes, we did have militia then instead of formal army, but if you went anywhere in the United States, people had, particularly since we were 90% rural, everybody had a gun. You know, they shot the gun for food and for protection, and it was just a part of our life, and we started it that way. And I read different reports on how many guns we have in the United States, but you know, there's 330 million of us, and I think there's about 300 million guns in the country. Most of them have been bought normally and legally, but an awful lot of them, in fact, the vast majority of those that are used in crimes are bought on the street. They're not bought down at the store. We have examples of it being otherwise, but that's the biggest thing. So he'll give us a good rundown on that. And then Jim Love's going to come back and talk to us on the following week. And we always enjoy Jim's presentations. So we're geared up pretty good for here the next several Saturdays. If any of you know of anyone who would like to speak to an open ears group and listen to just about anybody, tell us anything, invite them to get in touch with Tom or myself. We'll be glad to get them scheduled in to come in and talk. I'll mention this just briefly, and that is, like the other places we've managed to meet, our restaurant is kind to us. We get the meeting room without having to raise the entrance fee to cover a fixed charge, but we do need to be coming and buying food. They're not just in the business to provide free seats. So please do order food. Please do be generous with your server. We want to leave them with a smile on their face from our being here tonight, because we certainly enjoy the privilege of doing it. So John Beasley's going to MC us tonight, and he knows the routine, and he'll take good care of us, but I just wanted to give those few opening comments. So John, if you're ready, it's all yours, and we'll get the show on the road. Anybody have any announcements they need to make? I didn't think to ask about that. So blasted dark in here, I can't see hands very good, but yell at me if you've got an announcement.
Turn up the volume a little.
Turn it up a little? All right, I got my mouth right on it.
Yes.
Well, that speaker is directed toward the phone in there. Okay.
Yeah, we'll try that, and hopefully it won't feedback. We'll try a little bit more.
Are you operating the camera tonight?
Oh, you're
Well, thank you all for coming this evening. It's nice to see a crowd. Tonight is the 301st meeting of this austere group. I think it's been going from, what about? You can't hear me? Ah, well, okay. Anyway, this is meeting number 301, and tonight the topic is Islam is not the problem. And my good friend Steven R. Butler, Dr. Steven R. Butler, is going to talk about this topic. So please give a very warm welcome to Steve. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Can you hear me? There we go. I put them up here near my mouth so you can see. This is, I can't remember if this is the third or fourth time or the fifth time I've talked here. Not here at this particular restaurant, but in front of this group. Anyway, before I begin, I want to make an announcement about something. Since my last presentation, which was back in September at Barbeck's, I have started a small independent publishing company. And my first offering has just been printed. It's hot off the press. And I brought 2 copies with me tonight. It's called A Biblical Merry-Go-Round and Other Essays. And it was not actually written by me. It was written by my great-granduncle back in the 1940s. He was a farmer, a railroad carpenter, a building contractor. He built a lot of houses here in Dallas, and a self-taught bookbinder. Let me go ahead and just read you the rest of the blurb here. Despite a lack of formal education, he was also a studious man, a voracious reader, and a freethinker. In 1944 and 45, when he was 79 years old, he wrote 2 long essays in which he recorded his thoughts and opinions regarding religion. These essays, together with 2 short pieces composed nearly 20 years earlier and another written in 1946, make up this posthumous work in which the author asks, in an occasionally humorous and conversational style of writing, some thought-provoking questions that challenge the veracity of one of humankind's oldest and most sacred concepts. So this is not a book, this is nothing like The Purpose-Driven Life, okay, or anything like that. Quite the opposite. So if you're interested in having one of these 2 copies, we're going to give away these 2 copies tonight as door prizes. And John or Jim or someone's going to come around in a minute. And if you're interested in entering the drawing, take a slip of paper, write your name on it, put it back in the little container here. And then at the end of my presentation, we'll have a drawing. And I'll pull 2 names out. And you'll get a copy of the book if I pull your name out of the hat, or out of the box. Okay. So this is called A Biblical Merry-Go-Round and Other Essays by Arthur Babb, a man you've never heard of, but I think you'll enjoy his writing if you like this sort of thing. And I edited it, introduced it, and annotated it. Okay. I'm just curious. I'm going to deviate from my opening just for a second here because something caught my attention just as I was leaving the house tonight. I was checking my email, and as soon as I get on my email, it automatically takes me to news. And I saw a headline that caught my attention. And I'm just wondering how many Americans would react if some prominent person said, "I'm a Muslim first and an American second." How do you think people would react? Just curious. What do you think?
Negative.
It'd probably be, yeah. Do you agree with Jim? Be a negative reaction? Somebody said that?
That's what the evangelists.
Because the religion and the politics are mixed.
Okay, well, here's the headline that caught my attention. Ted Cruz tells reporters, "I'm a Christian first, American second." Now suddenly, maybe it doesn't seem so bad to some people. Okay. Saw that coming, huh? Okay, let me go ahead and launch into my dissertation here. First of all, I want to be clear about something. I'm not here tonight either to defend or to deride the Muslim religion. nor am I here to excuse or justify any sort of violent extremism. This past November, the news that radical Islamic suicide bombers had killed or wounded nearly 200 innocent civilians during surprise attacks in Paris filled me with the same mixture of sadness, horror, revulsion, and anger that I don't doubt that most, if not all of you, likewise felt when you heard the news. I felt the same when only a few weeks later, 2 radical Muslims killed 14 of their co-workers at an office party in San Bernardino, California. The official response to these attacks has been unsurprising. In France, authorities have vowed revenge, and in the United States and other nations that have already been the target of terrorism, such as Great Britain, there is heightened security. National leaders, as well as those who aspire to be, have announced that they are praying for the families of the victims and have called on others to do the same. Sadly, but not surprising, but unsurprisingly, many Americans, including certain would-be presidential candidates, have responded to these events by adopting a hostile attitude, not just toward the misguided groups and individuals that perpetrated these outrages, but toward all Muslims. Here in the United States, a particularly virulent form of Islamophobia seems to be spreading. One example of this blame all Muslims attitude is the response by 32 states and also some of the Republican presidential hopefuls, most notably Mr. Trump and Mr. Carson, who called for a ban on Muslim refugees from Syria, saying that only Christians should be allowed asylum in this country. There are some who worry, however, that even that requirement has a fatal flaw, that jihadists could still enter the United States by masquerading as Christians. Now, certainly, I don't doubt that's possible. After all, there are thousands, perhaps millions of Republicans who have been masquerading as Christians for decades. One particularly egregious example of this growing them against us attitude are statements made by Pastor Robert Jeffress of the First Baptist Church of Dallas, who almost immediately following the attacks in Paris gave a sermon in which he labeled Islam a false religion that was, quote, spawned by the devil. Another example is an email that was recently forwarded to me by a devout Christian with whom I have never shared my opinions regarding politics or religion. This email, which some of you may have also received, poses the question, can good Muslims be good Americans? The question is said to have originally been asked of a friend who worked in Saudi Arabia for 20 years, who then answered in the negative by providing certain proofs that Muslims cannot possibly be good Americans in any one of the following 10 areas: theologically, religiously, scripturally, geographically, socially, politically, domestically, intellectually, philosophically, and spiritually. The email concludes with this observation: therefore, after much study and deliberation, perhaps we should be suspicious of all Muslims in this country. They obviously cannot be both good Muslims and good Americans. Call it what you wish, it is the truth. You had better believe it. The more you understand this, the better it will be for our country and our future. The religious war is bigger than we know or understand. This email troubles me for 2 reasons. One is that it seems to ignore the fact that in the United States, thanks to the First Amendment to the Constitution, we have freedom of religion, which, believe it or not, is something that I support in spite of the fact, as should be apparent by my attire, that I am an atheist. It appears, however, that the writer of this email, apparently a Christian, does not support freedom of religion, except for Christians, and perhaps also for Jews. In an effort to make this case, The anonymous email writer sets up a double standard that is not only unfair and misleading, but also disingenuous, because each of the accusations regarding Muslims can likewise be made about Christians or Jews. In short, this is a classic case of the proverbial pot calling the kettle black. Let's take a look at each of these proofs one by one. First, the email writer says that a good Muslim cannot be a good American because, on theological grounds, because his allegiance is to Allah, the moon god of Arabia. Well, I'd never heard of Allah being described as the moon god of Arabia, so I decided to go online to see if I could find out more about it. The first place I looked was a website that provided a list of lunar deities. No Allah listed. Eventually, I did find a website called faithfreedom.org that made it clear that some Christians are indeed claiming that Allah was actually the name for an ancient Arabian pagan moon god, obviously in an effort to discredit the Muslim deity. At least two other sites, BibleBelievers.org AU and BillionBibles.org, make the same claim. Not surprisingly, I also found the site GodAllah.com, which disputes this argument. There may be others that take either side of this issue, but it really doesn't matter, because it is pretty clear that what we have here is a classic example of the almost juvenile attitude many religious people take towards the believers of other faiths, as if to say, my imaginary deity is better than your imaginary deity, or my God can beat up your God. Muslims, or anyone else for that matter, could counterclaim that neither Christians nor Jews can be good Americans because theologically their allegiance is to Yahweh, who, according to several informative websites, was the national god of the Iron Age kingdoms of Israel and Judah. These sites further explain that the name may have originated as an epithet of the god El, head of the Bronze Age Canaanite pantheon. It says further that the earliest plausible reference to a deity called Yahweh appears in Egyptian texts of the 13th century BCE that place him among the Shasu Bedu of southern Transjordan, whatever that is. Although he appears to have been unique to Israel and Judah. Finally, it adds, in the oldest biblical literature, 12th to 11th centuries BCE, Yahweh is a typical ancient Near Eastern divine warrior who leads the heavenly army against Israel's enemies. He and Israel are bound by a covenant under which Yahweh will protect Israel, and in turn Israel will not worship other gods. I have to add that all this talk of Yahweh ties in very well with a question that has troubled me for quite some time. If the Christian or Jewish God is the only God there is, as both Christians and Jews claim, then why does God say in the so-called Ten Commandments that he is a jealous God and that they should not worship any other gods? If there are no other gods, then there should be no one for God to be jealous of, right? So why mention it? Likewise, there would be no need for him to admonish his followers to worship no other gods. So what it appears that God is saying is, look here, there are lots of gods, but I'm the only one you better worship. And if you don't obey me, you're going to be in big trouble. Of course, what some Christians or Jews will say is, well, what God was talking about was false or pagan gods. Really? Where exactly in the Bible or Torah does it say that? The answer is nowhere. I know because I've looked. There are plenty of references to false witnesses, false prophets, and in the New Testament, a false Christ or two, but no references to false gods. As for the word pagan, it is nowhere to be found, at least in my King James Version of the Bible, and if you don't believe me, you can look for yourself. The writer of the email next says that Muslims cannot be good Americans on a religious basis because no other religion is accepted by his Allah except Islam. Well, it is certainly true that Muslims accept the tenets of no other religion but their own. But come on, isn't it likewise true that Christians don't accept any other religion but Christianity? And Jews don't accept any other religion but Judaism? There is no question that Christians believe that Jews and Muslims, as well as atheists like me, are all going to hell because they don't accept Jesus Christ as their Lord and Savior, while the Jews and Muslims think the Christians are deluded because they put their faith in a man who was reportedly the Son of God but wasn't really. They can't all be right. Someone has to be wrong. Personally, like my hero Thomas Paine, I think they all are. The email writer then goes on to say that Muslims cannot be good Americans because their allegiance is to the 5 pillars of Islam and the Quran. Interesting. But what are the 5 pillars of Islam? Unfortunately, the writer of the email does not say. But here is what I found on a popular website. The 5 pillars of Islam are 5 basic acts in Islam considered mandatory by believers and are the foundation of Muslim life. They are summarized in the famous hadith of Gabriel. They make up Muslim life, prayer, concern for the needy, self-purification, and the pilgrimage. And here they are in order. Number 1. Shahada. I don't know if I'm pronouncing these correctly, sir, because I'm not a Muslim, so I don't know. But I think it's Shahada. Declaring that there is no God except God and Muhammad is God's messenger. 2. Salat. Ritual prayer 5 times a day. 3. Zakat. Giving 2.5% of one's savings to the poor and needy. 4. Sawm. Fasting and self-control during the holy month of Ramadan. 5. Hajj. Pilgrimage to Mecca at least once in a lifetime, if one is able. Now, I have to say that I'm completely at a loss to understand why any of these 5 pillars are inconsistent with being a good American. Just like Muslims, Christians and Jews both say there is only one God. Additionally, both Christians and Jews pray on a regular basis, at least once a week, if not more often. Both Christians and Jews are encouraged to help the poor and needy, even if some of them, especially Christian conservatives, routinely oppose legislation that is designed to do that very thing. Both Christians and Jews have religious observances that involve fasting and/or self-control. The Christians, for example, have Lent. The Jews have at least 4 fast days, including Yom Kippur. Finally, they are all under no special obligation to do so, but both Christians and Jews not living in Israel often make what can be called a pilgrimage to the so-called Holy Land, including the so-called Holy City of Jerusalem. So once again, we find the email writer has set up a double standard. Next, the email writer says that the Muslim is unable to be a good American socially because his allegiance to Islam forbids him to make friends with Christians or Jews. Again, we could just as easily say the same about Christians and Jews. In fact, the Bible does not simply say that believers in the Christian or Jewish God should stay away from those who do not. It is much worse than that. In Deuteronomy 12, verses 2 through 3, it says quite clearly, and I'm quoting here from the Bible, "Ye shall utterly destroy all the places wherein the nations which ye shall possess serve their gods. Upon the high mountains, and upon the hills, and under every green tree. And ye shall overthrow their altars, and break their pillars, and burn their groves with fire. And ye shall hew down the graven images of their gods, and destroy the names of them out of that place." But wait, there's more. Here's what it says in Deuteronomy 13, verses 6 through 10. "If thy brother, the son of thy mother, or thy son, or thy daughter, or the wife of thy bosom, or thy friend, which is as thine own soul, entice thee secretly, saying, Let us go and serve other gods, which thou hast not known, thou nor thy fathers, namely of the gods of the people which are around about you, nigh unto thee, or far off from thee, from the one end of the earth, even unto the other end of the earth." Thou shalt not consent unto him, nor hearken unto him, and neither shall thine eye pity him. Neither shalt thou spare, neither shalt thou conceal him, but thou shalt surely kill him. Thine hand shall be first upon him to put him to death, and afterwards the hand of all the people, and thou shalt stone him with stones, that he may die. Sounds pretty unsociable, doesn't it? Now let's take a look at the accusation that Muslims are incapable of being good citizens on political grounds. Although it is certainly true that some mullahs encourage the destruction of Israel in the United States, it is equally true that the vast majority of Muslims do not heed their words. Furthermore, one rarely, if ever, hears of a mullah in the United States using such inflammatory rhetoric. Most that do reside in the Middle East, along with a handful in European nations such as Great Britain, where, unlike in the United States, the Muslim immigrant population has experienced a much more difficult time assimilating. There are presently about 1.6 billion Muslims in the world, which is approximately 22% of the Earth's population. In the United States, they make up less than 1% of the population. The question we ought to be asking is, how many Muslims worldwide are actively engaged in jihad or holy war? The answer, according to the Bipartisan Policy Center's Homeland Security Project, is an estimated 85,000 on the low end, and on the high end, 160,000. Out of a world Muslim population of 1.6 billion, that number is statistically very low. That is about 6%. Here is what one commentator, CNN's Peter Bergen, has to say about this number. By historical standards, this is hardly a major threat. At the end of the Cold War, Soviet and other Warsaw Pact countries could muster around 6 million men to fight in a war against the West, a number that is some 60 times greater than the total number of militants estimated to be fighting for jihadist organizations today. And of course, the Soviets had a vast supply of nuclear-armed, land-based missiles, nuclear-armed submarines, nuclear-armed bombers, and many other highly sophisticated weapons systems that jihadist organizations have never acquired and are quite unlikely to. The only reasonable conclusion to draw is that the threat posed by jihadist organizations around the globe is quite inconsequential when compared with what the West faced in the past century. Now, don't get me wrong. I am not saying that Muslim extremists do not pose any sort of threat. However, it appears to me, a person who lives in a city where one of the largest mosques in Texas is located, and who also counts a large number of Muslims among his students, that most of the Muslims who live in the United States came here because they do not wish to live under politically repressive regimes or the strict Sharia law that prevails in a number of Middle Eastern nations, but rather because they appreciate the freedom and the opportunities the United States has to offer, as well as the general climate of religious toleration. Let's get real. Why on earth would Muslim Americans want to call for or aid in the destruction of a country that has provided them with a much better life? The email writer also accuses Muslims of being bad Americans because domestically he is instructed to marry 4 women and beat and scourge his wife when she disobeys him. As proof, he cites the Quran, Surah 4, verse 34, which actually says nothing at all about how many wives a man must have, nor does it mention scourging, although I must concede it does tell a man to beat his wife, singular, if she is disobedient. That being said, I have to ask, how many male Muslims living in the United States have 4 wives? Since polygamy is illegal in every state in this country, to the best of my knowledge, I think the answer most likely is none. And do these men beat and scourge the wives they do have? Perhaps some of them do. But let's face it, wife beating is likewise illegal. Furthermore, wife beating is certainly not restricted to the adherents of any one religion. My first stepfather was a Christian, and when I was a child, he routinely beat my mother and got away with it too, during an era when the authorities rarely intervened in such cases. I feel confident that statistics, if there are any on this topic, would show that the majority of wife beaters in the United States are Christians, not Muslims. And as for polygamy, as I pointed out in a previous presentation, the Bible is full of it. Just a cursory glance reveals that many of the Israelites had 2 or more wives. One fellow, Rehoboam, had 18, and King Solomon had 700 wives, as well as 300 concubines. So apparently, polygamy is okay with the Judeo-Christian God as well. Next, the email writer says that on an intellectual level, the Muslim is incapable of being a good American because he cannot accept the American Constitution, since it is based on biblical principles and he believes the Bible to be corrupt. Well, at this point, I have to say that if you haven't figured it out already, it's pretty clear that the writer of this email is either terribly misinformed or as intellectually dishonest as all the other religious right-wingers who go around claiming that our Constitution created a Christian nation and that its laws are based on biblical principles. All I can say is thank goodness none of that is true. If it was, we might still be hanging witches. It is a historical fact that if anything, the United States Constitution is one of the most irreligious legal documents in the world. For a start, unlike our state constitutions, there is no mention of God in any way, shape, or form, nor is there any reference to Jesus or Christianity or the Bible. It seems to me that if the founders intended to set up a Christian nation, they would have said so. But no, there's nothing indicating that in the Constitution. They didn't even include the words, "So help me God," as part of the presidential oath, even though a lot of presidents and Supreme Court justices have added that extra legal phrase to the inaugural ceremony. Nor did the founders restrict office holding to Christians. In fact, the Constitution says the very opposite, namely that there will be no religious test for any federal office, which leaves the door open to anyone, including Jews, Muslims, and even atheists. What's interesting is that many ultra-religious Americans of the 19th century took great offense at this basically secular document and the fact that it didn't create a Christian nation. Now, some 200 years later, there are all sorts of misguided morons trying to make the opposite argument, and that in fact it does, basing such claims on minor details, such as the fact that the Constitution was signed in the year of our Lord, 1787, or the fact that the president holds onto a bill without, or if the president holds onto a bill without signing it for 10 days, Sundays accepted, it automatically becomes law. Frankly, I just don't understand how anyone can make the claim that the Constitution is based on supposed biblical principles. I've looked in the Bible, and I can assure you that there is no mention there of representative democracy, of republicanism, of individual rights or liberty, or separation of powers. There is likewise no reference to checks and balances, and when it comes to the relationship between church and state, Jesus, if he actually existed, clearly came down on the side of separation when he supposedly said, "Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's." One Bible verse that the religious right routinely trots out when trying to prove their case is Isaiah 33:22, which reads, "For the Lord is our judge, the Lord is our lawgiver, the Lord is our king, he will save us." They say this is the model for the 3 branches of our government, the judicial, the legislative, and the executive. Frankly, I don't get the supposed connection of this verse to our form of government. If God is judge, lawmaker, and king all rolled into one, then he is a tyrant and a dictator, and certainly no model for democracy. Another thing that bothers me about this email, apart from it setting up a double standard, is that instead of promoting unity, it plays on people's fears to foster divisiveness. Rather than seeking ways to break down barriers of misunderstanding, it chooses to erect them instead by promoting the irrational hatred of others. These are some of the principal reasons why I dislike the entire concept of religion. Unfortunately, despite the fact that religious freedom is enshrined in the First Amendment to the Constitution, our nation has a long history of intolerance. Although Christian conservatives correctly point out that many Europeans fled the so-called Old World in order to find religious liberty in North America, what these same folks usually fail to add is that almost as soon as these refugees arrived, they instituted governments that were every bit as repressive as the ones from which they had escaped. One of the worst places to be in colonial America, if you were a Catholic, a Quaker, or a Jew, was Puritan New England, where they used red-hot pokers to bore holes through the tongues of imprisoned heretics, or branded them. They even hanged a few dissenters, not because they had killed or raped or robbed anyone, but because their religion, their religious beliefs or practices did not conform to the Puritan way of worship. In colonial Massachusetts, as most people know, the authorities also committed judicial murder by hanging people they imagined were witches. Throughout the entire colonial era, the only one of the 13 colonies with complete religious freedom was Rhode Island. Sad to say, I need a good drink.
That's safe.
Getting a little dry. Sad to say, intolerance did not suddenly disappear with the establishment of the United States and the Constitution's supposed guarantees of religious freedom. Throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, religious bigotry frequently reared its ugly head. Some of this intolerance was mean-spirited, but otherwise harmless, such as mainstream Christians ridiculing the Shakers for the peculiar way they lived and worshipped, or labeling Unitarians heretics because they rejected the Trinitarian notion that God was somehow magically three beings rolled into one. There were times, however, when intolerance turned murderous. In the 1840s, after the governor of Missouri called for the Mormons to either be driven out of the state or exterminated, the precise word he used, by the way, mainstream Christians responded by making war on the so-called saints, killing as many of them as they could, including church founder Joseph Smith and his brother Hiram. When Mormon leaders appealed to the federal government for the protection they constitutionally deserved, their pleas fell on deaf ears. This explains why they eventually fled the states, seeking safety in the remoteness of the Great Salt Lake Valley of present-day Utah. Other religious groups have likewise faced hostility from the Protestant Christian majority. In the 1920s, widespread anti-Semitism and anti-Catholic sentiment not only fueled a nationwide revival of the Ku Klux Klan, but also led to the passage by a largely Republican Congress of a restrictive immigration law that set up a quota system favoring immigrants from Protestant nations and cutting back drastically on the number allowed to come from countries where there were large numbers of Catholics or Jews. As late as 1960, the loyalty and patriotism of Roman Catholics was still so suspect in the United States that presidential candidate John F. Kennedy found it necessary to assure a convention of Protestant ministers that he firmly believed in separation of church and state, and if elected, would not be taking orders from the Pope. It has only been since the 1980s, when Catholics began teaming up with the Protestant evangelicals to oppose abortion laws, that anti-Catholic sentiment began to see a significant decline. In regard to Muslims, I fully understand why, on a purely visceral level, some of my fellow Americans are fearful. After all, as many observers have pointed out, there are no Christian or Jewish suicide bombers, nor any Christian or Jews openly proclaiming a holy war, at least not in modern times. I have a theory that the reason why Islam seems so troublesome on the world stage at this moment in time is because it is going through its historical adolescence. Of the three major world faiths that trace their roots back to the patriarch Abraham, Judaism, which is approximately 3,500 years old, is the oldest. Next is Christianity, which is nearly 2,000 years old. But Islam is only 1,400 years old. You have only to read the first few books of the so-called Old Testament of the Bible to see that the ancient Israelites were a very bloodthirsty bunch of people, as were medieval Christians, who seem to have enjoyed their crusades, witch burnings, and inquisitions as much as Moses liked to stone people for picking up sticks on the Sabbath. In stark contrast, today's Jews are some of the most peaceful people you are ever likely to meet, unless, of course, you are someone who is raining rockets down on their towns and cities in Israel. Christianity is likewise matured and mellowed. It is my hope that the extremists we now find taking cover under Islam will likewise decline in number over time. Although ideally, I would prefer to see people of all three faiths, and every other religion for that matter, voluntarily taking the road of reason instead. But more about that in just a little while. In the meantime, what are we to do about the current situation? Well, for a start, the one thing we ought not to be doing is blaming innocent, law-abiding, moderate Muslims for the actions of their extremist brethren. Unfortunately, the attitude that many Christian Americans have taken towards Muslim Americans in recent times reminds me of something I read in the Life and Times of Frederick Douglass. Douglass, you may recall, was a runaway slave turned abolitionist who during the Civil War occasionally met with President Lincoln in the White House. During one of these visits, Douglass suggested that whenever the Confederacy should shoot or hang colored soldiers in cold blood, the Union ought to retaliate in kind and shoot or hang and without delay and retaliate in kind. Sorry, I messed it up. And the Union ought to retaliate in kind and degree without delay upon Confederate prisoners in its hands. Douglass recalled that Lincoln did not receive this suggestion with enthusiasm, replying that retaliation was a terrible remedy and one which it was very difficult to apply, one which if once begun there was no telling where it would end, that if he could get hold of the Confederate soldiers who had been guilty of treating colored soldiers as felons, he would easily retaliate. But the thought of hanging men for a crime perpetrated by others was revolting to his feelings. Another reason we ought not to be maltreating our Muslim population is because it is potentially counterproductive. When a mosque is defaced with graffiti or damaged in some way, when anti-Muslim pickets carrying provocative signs surround a mosque, when unoffending Muslims minding their own business are targeted for verbal or physical abuse, such behavior plays right into the hands of the extremists, who are eager to recruit new jihadists. What I fear as much as anything is that if Americans do things, either officially or unofficially, to make Muslim Americans or even recently arrived immigrants feel unwelcome, hated, and suspected, some of them, particularly impressionable, easily led young people, could end up becoming the sort of dangerous fanatics we all have good reason to fear. Although I recognize that when contrasted with the violence perpetrated by Muslim extremists around the world, Islamophobic activity in this country pales by comparison, it ought to be remembered that these things are two sides of the same coin. Both are rooted in suspicion, fear, and irrational thinking, and to a reasonable, peaceful person, neither one excuses nor justifies the other. This brings me at last to the main point I want to make tonight. As I said at the outset, I am not here tonight to either defend or deride Islam in particular. My purpose instead is to make the case that no one religion can bear sole responsibility for what is wrong in the world today, with the possible exception of the Jains, who quite literally would not hurt a fly. One religious faith is just as much to blame as another. Unfortunately, people around the world, including here in America, are so thoroughly immersed in their own culture that they can't see the forest for the trees. In other words, as we atheists can make out quite plainly, it is not a single religion that is problematic, but rather the entire concept or idea of religion itself. It ought to be plain to any person who is paying the least attention that not a day goes by without reports of discord in various parts of the world where it is equally clear that religion is the root cause. It's not just Muslim extremists versus the West. It's also fundamentalists versus moderates, Orthodox versus liberals, Catholics versus Protestants, Sunnis versus Shiites, Hindus versus Muslims, and so on down the line. It ought to be plain that the reason for this disharmony, which all too often turns violent, is because all religions are mutually exclusive. Each one claims some special insight or path to enlightenment or salvation. As a consequence, they create artificial divisions among people that are not only completely unnecessary, but also counterproductive to the progress of humanity. Religious people often defend their beliefs by saying that if they aren't true, then why do so many people adhere to them? Well, first of all, just because a large number of people believe something doesn't make it true. There once was a time when humanity believed that the sun revolved around the earth. We now know, thanks to science, that it is the other way around. What makes something true is not unquestioning belief or numbers of believers, but credible evidence. It should also be plain to anyone who is paying attention that the main reason that there are so many religious people in the world, even in these modern times, is due to the almost universal practice of proselytizing the young and innocent. As Professor Richard Dawkins, perhaps the best known atheist in the world today, has often said so well, there are no Christian children, no Jewish children, no Muslim children, no Hindu children, and so on. There are simply children. Unfortunately, long before they reach the age where they can think for themselves, their parents and other well-intended but misguided adults have convinced them that they are something special and different from other people by teaching them to accept on authority alone something for which there is absolutely no credible evidence. Just last month, in December, as he was returning from one of his trips abroad, Pope Francis was quoted as saying that religious fundamentalism is a disease that exists in all religions. He was nearly right. Unfortunately, he stopped short of identifying the actual problem. The truth is that it is not just fundamentalism, but the very concept of religion itself that is like a disease, caused by a virus resistant to antibiotics, which in the case of religion are reason, common sense, and rationality. As long as human beings keep subscribing to the idea that there is some spiritual supernatural world inhabited by fantastic beings, and to the equally nonsensical notion that the people who lead us in our worship of them are worthy of respect, instead of being shunned as the charlatans they are, as long as people cling to the irrational belief that prayers are actually heard and acted upon by the imaginary deities to whom they are directed, the world will continue to have more problems than it would have than if we confined our disputes to issues that are genuine and not to things that have no substance in fact. Here are some examples. Everyone knows that the focus of a large percentage of the religious discord in this world is the state of Israel. a country that presently exists largely because, according to the Torah, the Jews believe that their God Yahweh gave it to them after Moses allegedly led them out of Egypt, a story unsupported by any credible evidence. I have to admit that, like a lot of naive people, I long supported the idea of a Jewish homeland in the Middle East because my heart went out to the Jews on account of their suffering, not just during the Second World War, but also throughout the centuries since the diaspora. And I still do feel sympathetic because, as I hope I've already made plain, I do not countenance ill treatment of any kind based on religious prejudice. It was not until much later, however, after I'd pondered the situation and tried to learn more about it, that I had a sort of aha moment when I came to the realization that the root cause of the Jews being singled out for persecution was religion, plain and simple, both their own and also the religion of the people who were persecuting them. When I made the transition from believer to non-believer, I also realized that since there is no God, there was no God who gave land to anyone, anywhere, at any time in history. If Israel was not the only true Western-style democracy in the Middle East, I could not in good conscience continue to support it. And in point of fact, there are some things it has done, such as the building of settlements in the occupied territories, which I cannot and will not defend. But one thing is certain, I do not believe that the Israelis, or anyone else for that matter, can claim a divine right to the so-called Holy Land, a small sliver of territory that I doubt anyone in their right mind would want at all if they did not believe it to be sacred. And I find it both tragic and extremely troubling that so many lives, so much money, and so much time and energy has been wasted over the centuries by people trying to conquer it, hold on to it, or reconquer it on account of their religious beliefs. Even the most cursory glance at history reveals that the Jews are no exception when it comes to calling on the supposed creator of the universe to back them up. Throughout history, people of all faiths have frequently invoked the name of God to justify their actions. Anglo-Americans, as well as our European ancestors before us, have certainly been no slackers in that regard. It's how we justified wresting control of this continent from its original inhabitants. National leaders in all times and places have been particularly prone to invoke the Almighty. Whenever they seek unquestioned acceptance of whatever it is they want to do, they simply say that God has told them to do it. That's how for centuries kings and emperors ruled by divine right. As recently as 2002, President George W. Bush played the religion card when he said that God wanted him to go into Iraq and unseat Saddam Hussein. As we all know, Bush also played the fear card, as many presidential hopefuls are presently doing, despite the fact that there was no credible evidence, either before or after the war, that the Iraqi dictator actually harbored any weapons of mass destruction, as Bush and his cronies had alleged. I am not so naive as to believe that religion will disappear from the face of the earth in my lifetime, or that it will be easy to convince people to give it up. Unfortunately, belief in the supernatural is so pervasive in our society that I suspect it's only atheists like me who actually notice how widespread and commonplace it has become. One reason is because it's not just the churches, synagogues, and mosques that are keeping it alive, nor is it due solely to the efforts of the hundreds of mostly Christian radio and television stations that promote it 24/7. It's also the government, which puts "In God We Trust" on our money, hires chaplains for the Congress, and requires the president by law to declare a national day of prayer. Mainstream media likewise promotes and encourages religion. Sometimes it's just little things, like the other day when a local news station reported that a man had been ticketed for reading while driving. One of the newscasters then held up a Bible and said, "This may be the good book, but don't read it while you're driving." the networks are equally guilty, if not more so. When I first began writing this presentation in the wake of the Paris bombings, I happened to turn on the television one day and saw ABC News' Robin Roberts interviewing Sarah Palin, who was holding forth about our supposed need to let God into our lives and let him guide us. And Robin Roberts, who seems to be just as thoroughly indoctrinated as Palin, enthusiastically remarked, "When fear knocks, let faith answer the door." It never ceases to amaze me that so many people, not just Sarah Palin and Robin Roberts, seem to think that faith is a virtue that ought to be encouraged and respected. My feelings on the matter are quite the opposite. When I hear people say they have faith, what that tells me is that they are gullible enough to believe in things for which there is absolutely no credible evidence. If I told you that space aliens had landed in my backyard, or that eating chocolate ice cream cured cancer, would you believe me just on my say-so? No. I don't doubt you would demand some proof. But when an authority figure attired in a black robe tells you an implausible story about a man conversing with a burning bush, or about an itinerant Jewish rabbi who lived some 2,000 years ago, who supposedly died for your sins, and that all you have to do to achieve everlasting life is to declare your belief in that incredible story, you don't blink an eye. Does that really make any sense? As Archie Bunker explained to his son-in-law, Michael Meathead Stivic, in an episode of the classic TV comedy show All in the Family, it ain't supposed to make sense. It's faith. Faith is something you believe that nobody in his right mind would believe. Although I have no use for faith, I have a great deal of respect for science. There is no doubt in my mind that one good scientist is worth 1,000 clergymen, maybe more. There is no question that science has done far more in just the past 300 or 400 years to advance the health, safety, and happiness of humankind than all the religions that have ever existed throughout millennia, including all those of today. As my great-granduncle Arthur Babb once said, faith has never advanced civilization. It may console, but it does not advance. It is science and invention that put us ahead. If anything, religions have retarded progress by opposing new discoveries that brought hitherto sacrosanct biblical teachings into question. It is therefore very difficult for me to have any sort of respect for clergymen or religious leaders of any kind. Although some of them appear to be gentle, considerate people who genuinely seem to care for others, by teaching their congregations or followers to believe in something that doesn't actually exist, and to encourage and promote the notion that evidence isn't necessary to belief, they do us all a great disservice, especially the little children whose trusting, simple minds they are infusing with all these ill-considered ideas. Pope Francis is just such a person. Although he seems to be a lot more open-minded and tolerant than most of his predecessors, I would think much more highly of him if tomorrow he declared that the Roman Catholic Church was going out of business, admitted frankly that it had been perpetrating an enormous fraud on humankind for the past 1,700 years, that St. Peter's Basilica was going to be turned into a museum, and that all the admission fees from visitors would be donated to charities and scientific research projects around the world, along with all the trillions of dollars that the Church almost certainly already possesses in the form of cash, investments, and real estate holdings. If giving up religion altogether seems like a revolutionary, radical idea, that's because it is. But it doesn't mean we should not do it. There are a number of notable precedents. One long-held erroneous idea that our ancestors gave up was the divine right of kings to rule. Another was slavery, along with the notion that the color of one's skin determined whether he or she was inferior or superior to other people. A third idea we've tossed into the rubbish bin of history is that women are unworthy to vote, to hold political office, or to have the same property rights and job opportunities as men. Imagine how much further along we might be if half of the humanity had not been denied for centuries the chance to make a contribution to the betterment of the world. It is an incontrovertible fact that many, if not all of you, have already given up, probably, the more unpleasant facts of your faith. I would be willing to bet that unless you're an atheist like me, most, if not all of you, are only moderately religious Christians. This means that even though you still believe in God, and maybe even go to church on a regular basis, you ignore or overlook all the bad things in the Bible, like God commanding the Israelites to slaughter their enemies, even the women and children, and concentrate instead on the good things like Jesus saying that we should love one another and turn the other cheek and give all our worldly goods to the poor. Even though, obviously, most Christians don't actually do any of those things. But that's okay. In my book, that's far better than being a fundamentalist. So let me ask you, if you don't believe that homosexuals, disrespectful children, and people who work on Sunday should be stoned to death, as the Bible commands, why don't you just go ahead and give it all up? Ask yourself, do you know many people who have lied to you? The answer, I don't doubt, is plenty. Have you ever told a lie yourself? Of course you have, even if it was just a little white lie. Now ask yourself, how many people do you know who ever had a conversation with a burning bush? And how many people have you known who died and then came back from the dead? I'm certain the answer in both cases is none. Now ask yourself this, which is more likely, that a man actually had a conversation with a burning bush, or that a man who claimed to be the Son of God came back to life after being executed, or that someone lied about those things or simply made them up? Let me be clear. I am not asking you to give up morality or the rule of law. We need those things, all of us, to survive. But for the human race to advance more smoothly into the future, we also need to give up ancient superstitions imposed on us by ignorant, superstitious men who had less knowledge of the world than the average elementary school child today. 150 years ago in this country, men, women, and children who had been enslaved in their bodies were physically liberated. That is, the ownership of their bodies, which should have been theirs all along, was at last returned to them. If you are a religious believer, you are like a slave in your mind. What I'm encouraging you to do is to liberate your minds. Free them from the shackles of senseless tradition and superstition. Grant yourself the individual liberty, intellectual liberty, you deserve. And at the same time, you will also help liberate humanity from one of the greatest barriers to human progress that has ever existed, namely religion. Just as importantly, you will also stop providing cover for the extremist, whose beliefs in the supernatural are different from yours only by degree. If we live in a reality-based world where belief in imaginary gods is no longer encouraged, promoted, or respected, the fanatics will have nowhere left to hide and will hopefully eventually die out. I know from my own experience that it is not always easy to give up long-held beliefs. But once you are confronted with credible contrary evidence, to continue to cling to them is foolishness. As an example, I'll admit that as a child growing up in the segregated South, that although I don't recall ever hating black people the way that some whites seem to do, owing to the time and place in which I was raised, I innocently accepted the widespread notion that black people were somehow inferior to white people. In my late teens, after I began to have some interaction with individual African Americans, both on the job and in the armed forces, I began to realize my error. I also realized over time, and especially after I began reading his speeches, that the goal of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was not only to bring about the political and social equality of black people in America, but also to liberate the hearts and minds of white people, to help them see that the fears and prejudices of the past were without foundation and had no place in a civilized modern society. I hold that the same is true of religion. Despite any minor biological differences we may have, such as sex, skin color, eye color, hair color, gender identity, and so on, we are all one human race. For centuries and right up to the present day, religions have had the unfortunate effect of artificially dividing us into warring camps in which intolerance all too often leads to bloodshed. But just think, if we had no religions dividing us, if instead we all embraced our common humanity and recognized reality instead of positing some supernatural world for which there is absolutely no credible evidence, perhaps we might also come together to solve the very real problems that face us all on this tiny little blue marble racing through space. As I said at the outset, the problem is not Islam, nor is it Christianity or Judaism or any one of the other hundreds of different faiths to which human beings continue to cling. The problem is the entire concept of religion. And as long as you hold on to it, as long as you grant it the respect and legitimacy it does not deserve, you are enabling those who are not as moderate as you to find an excuse or a reason to carry out their hateful agendas. In short, if you are not part of the solution, then like it or not, you are part of the problem. I'll close by adding one little note. I think the time has come too for the American people to embrace political candidates who show respect for the Constitution by taking religion off the table while campaigning, and also while governing, a topic I may wish to address at some future time. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Now is the time you can ask questions.
Okay.
So these are questions and not statements. After the question period, then you have a chance to get up and rebut, okay? So who wants to ask the first
John,
question?
Can we wait just a minute so I can switch batteries?
Okay.
We could do the drawing while here.
Switching batteries?
By switching batteries.
Do we
Shake
hold
them
it?
up.
If I truly know how to do it.
Okay. All right. Okay, you can see I'm not looking, right? Okay, there's one. And there's another. Whoops, I got two.
Well, I can't get
All
it
right.
out. We'll just see if it runs long enough.
Let's see here. Is it Beverly Cohn? Is that right?
Yes.
Yes, you won. Come here and get your prize. And Jean Dubico? Congratulations. There you go.
All right, I think we've
Are we ready to roll?
dispensed with the prizes. The first question, please.
We need the mic.
Back there.
You mentioned Israel. What, in your opinion, do you think is the ultimate goal of Netanyahu and the conservative Zionists with regard to Israel and Palestine?
Well, I suspect they'd like to take occupied territories and incorporate them into Israel, which I don't think they should do, but I think that's what they would like to do.
Next.
Who does that land belong to?
Which, you mean the occupied
Or
territory?
Palestine?
I think it should be the Palestinians.
Why?
Because I believe in a two-state solution.
You familiar with the 67 war?
Yes,
Who won?
the Israelis.
So whose land is it?
Well, they conquered it,
Yes, that's the answer I
but
was
they
looking
have
for.
not incorporated it into their territory formally.
That was the answer I was looking for. They won the land, didn't they? It is their land.
Well,
Thank you.
that's debatable.
Next question, please.
Behind you.
If you believe in a two-state solution, which land would the Palestinians get and which lands would the Israelis get?
The Israelis would go back to their original 1948 boundaries, and the Palestinians would have the rest.
Who would guarantee that border?
I would like to think the United Nations would take on the job.
How would they do that? How many troops, how many divisions would they put on that border to guarantee it?
I have no idea, but it would seem to me that if there was a two-state solution, if both sides agreed to live and let live, there probably wouldn't be a need for many troops.
Well, again, problem with one side is they don't have a continuity in one government to another. So one government could agree to it, but the next government that comes along is going to disavow it.
Well, that's absolutely possible. You're absolutely right. That could happen.
So there has to be a guarantor to enforce a guarantee, and there is none.
Well, like I said, the UN could take on that role.
When has the UN guarantee ever been valid? They can't even keep peace.
Well, they seem to do pretty well in Korea for a while anyway.
Well, that wasn't the UN, that was the United States.
That was the United Nations. Yes, it was mostly U.S. troops, I agree.
You're right.
But it was under the banner of the UN.
Well, the banner of the UN and the substance of the UN are two different things. The UN has been involved in a number of peacekeeping efforts since its creation, and roughly 20 million people have lost their lives in UN peacekeeping efforts because the UN can't keep peace. They can't keep peace from a thug going down the street and holding up a 7-Eleven in Baghdad.
Well,
As we used to say in Texas, they're about as useful as tits on a boar hog.
Is that a question?
I'm not sure if that was or not, anyway.
My question is, are you familiar with scientific research that has shown there's a part of the brain that has a need for religion, and what's your opinion on that?
I'm not very conversant on that, but I have a lot of doubts that there is such a thing. I don't think any of us have an inherent need to have religion. I certainly don't feel that way.
I believe their explanation is a social adhesive or something like that.
I think the problem, as I said in my presentation, was that we're all, or most of us anyway, it seems, are indoctrinated when we're very, very young. And we're never given any choice in the matter. When I was asked to join the Presbyterian Church back in 1961, nobody gave me an alternative. Nobody said, well, would you like to join the Lutherans instead? How about the Methodists or Baptists? Or maybe you'd like to be a Muslim or a Jew. You know, I think about this. How old do you have to be to drive a car in this state? Is it 16?
Yes,
Okay. How old do you have to be to vote?
18.
18. Okay, so we won't let people drive cars until they're 16. We won't let people vote, make political decisions until they're 18. But yet we'll let them join churches when they're 10 or 11 years old, or even younger. I think that's all wrong. I'm sorry? I said I don't think 10 or 11 years old is old enough to be making decisions about what religion you're going to follow for the rest of your life. Or whether you're going to follow a religion. Yes, go ahead.
Okay, next question. It's actually a question. I've heard you give some merit to the pillars of Islam, making a distinction between extremists and the faith itself. Looking on history, I have heard about the extremism. Do you think that maybe you could see some merit in what would be otherwise extremely barbaric cultures? Do you see any merit in organized faiths of people?
No, none at all.
Okay.
I think they've been mostly nothing, largely a lot of trouble.
Thank you.
Yeah, I have a question. Would you not consider possibly the practice of zealous, fervent, somewhat maniacal, fanatical atheism a form of religion that you seem to absolutely hate?
Well, first of all, atheism is not a religion. It can't be. Atheism is to religion as abstinence is to a sex position. It has no hallmarks of a religion.
Any more questions? All right. I'll allow two more questions.
Ignoring the whole, any possible contributions that any religion might have given to the world throughout history. I'll let that pass and seeing only the bad side. How about the idea that human nature, if there weren't any religions at all, would still find some way to get into groups and fight with each other and think one is better than the other? Even two neighbors can't get along. So I just don't think blaming human nature on religion might not really hold water.
Okay, well, let me just say that I agree with you that I don't think religion is, or getting rid of religion rather, would get away with all human disharmony, all arguments, all fights. But at least the fights would be more likely to be over something real. To me, the biggest tragedy in the world is to hear about somebody being killed, being martyred, whatever, on account of a belief in a supernatural world that simply doesn't exist. To me, that's extremely tragic. To die for your land because you're defending it from invaders, that to me is something that's honorable and makes sense. But to die for something that doesn't even exist just makes no sense at all. So it would remove at least what I think is the most egregious reason for people fighting among one another. But yeah, they'll probably still find ways to not get along. But at least it'll be over something real. Well, there's only one way to find out.
Is it your contention that present-day Islam is divided into at least two segments or two groups or two camps that could be described broadly in general terms as being a violent jihadist and a passive, peaceful coexistence group?
It seems to me, and I'm not an expert on the subject, okay? I don't claim to be. But just from general observation, it seems to me, and as I pointed out here, the government has come up with some figures on this, and they come up with about 6% of all Muslims worldwide, which leaves 94% that aren't actively engaged in jihad.
Well, so it's a reasonable first approximation to say that there might be at least two separate groups.
Well, they're separate, but
separate belief systems within one group.
That's hard to say because you see they both hold to the same. This is part of the point I'm trying to make about moderates and extremists, and not just Muslims, but Christians and everybody else as well. All that stuff that the jihadists trot out to, justify what they do, it's in the Quran. It's there. But the moderates don't pay any attention to it. Just like moderate Christians don't pay any attention to all the bad stuff in the Bible. Nobody's stoning anybody to death for picking up sticks on Sunday. right?
Okay, well, here's what I'm
So
just
what are you driving at?
Well, I'm trying to lay a foundation to ask another question. That is, do you think it would be reasonable for those of us in America, since we don't speak the language, we don't understand the culture, we don't know the Quran, to ask the imams for guidance in distinguishing between the moderates and the radicals?
I think we should definitely try to enlist moderate Muslims in the effort to combat the extremists, yes.
Well, the question about the two different factions or groups, the ones who are more peaceful and the ones who are jihadists, how do we know the difference?
How do you know the difference?
How do we know the difference? How do we know who is who?
That's a good question.
Ones have guns and machetes.
The thing about it is that nobody who's planning to surprise attack anyone is going to, if they're at least halfway intelligent, are going to let, show their hand, so to speak. Those same people who were not doing it because of religion, but because they were simply probably mentally deranged and went up and shot up movie theaters, how did we know that they were going to do that? We don't. So, I don't know. I don't know the answer to your question. We can't be sure. But I just am trying to make the point here that if we go around thinking that just because of a few bad apples, the whole bunch is spoiled, when that's not the case, we might add a few bad apples to the batch. And that's what I'm trying to ask us to avoid, to give them a reason, say, oh, they hate me, so I'm going to go fight them. If we embrace them, you've ever heard this old saying, keep your friends close, but your enemies closer? Well, I'm not saying that Muslims are our enemies, but I'm just saying that if you want things to go better in any situation, I think you need to reach out to the people concerned, not push them away. If we push them away, then there's not going to be any dialogue at all.
A while back, the other day that we had that other author that came in here, that speaker that spoke about Islam.
Unfortunately, I didn't see him. I was out in California.
Okay, so that's probably why you didn't get that point that he made. I think the main point he made was that the Quran, there are multiple Qurans, and that moderates tend to hold to the older, more accurate Quran, whereas the more present day, the newer Qurans, the ones that were written after the original Quran, were written to allow certain violent acts to occur in order to justify war and other things that kings wanted to accomplish that were Islamic kings. And so he says there's actually none of the violent stuff in the Quran that people are claiming is in the Quran. But you have to go back to you have to read the right Quran. And so the jihadists don't read the right Quran. So in order to determine whether somebody's a jihadi or not, might be easier to determine if you found out
what they're reading.
What they're reading.
Well, I've never heard that before. I wish I had been here. I was out in LA, so I wasn't able to attend that.
Also, there's Wahhabi, there's Sunni, there's Shiite, there's quite a few different groups. So when you're saying a jihadi, be specific. Are you talking about Shia jihadis or Shiite jihadis or Wahhabis?
Okay. Well, we can split hairs on all that, I suppose. But one of the things you may have missed the presentation I gave a while back about the Bible, and one of the things I pointed out is that there's more than one Bible. Also, there's a Protestant Bible, there's a Catholic Bible. There are lots and lots of books of the Bible that didn't make it into the Bible when they had the Council of Nicaea back in 325 CE. And so, who's to say what is the true holy text of any religion? But anyway, I guess what you're doing really is you're answering his question about how can you tell. Of course, if they're written in Arabic, we still have a problem if we only speak English, right? Yeah. Anyway.
Okay, Steve, thanks. Now is the time for you for any rebuttal. So, hands up the first rebuttal. Albert.
I knew Albert would get up there.
Very nice presentation. You certainly laid out your position on it. I would tend to say, however, that the hardest thing in the world to prove is a negative, that something does not exist, because it takes only one instance of it to prove that it does, or to lend credence to the fact that it does. And I'm sure there are a lot of people here who can claim honestly to have had healing through prayer. In my own life, I would not be alive on 2 different occasions without turning to God, literally. One of them from sickness, and one of them from avoiding an accident in the middle of the night in a snowstorm.
Yeah, we've heard that one.
Well, yeah, we've heard some of what you said before too. As far as the 6-day war that you brought up, not you, the USS Liberty was attacked by the Israeli Air Force, and a number of Americans were killed on that. And the Admiral of the United States Navy in the Mediterranean was going to send fighter planes to blast those Israeli airplanes out of the sky. And LBJ ordered him to stand down and said, I want that ship on the bottom of the Mediterranean and every man on it dead. That boat was a surveillance boat that in all probability could prove that Israel started the 6-day war. And that was the reason they wanted to get rid of that. There's a guy by the name of Ostrovsky who defected from the Mossad and wrote several books, one of which is By Way of Deception, the motto of the Mossad. And he pointed out that the first attack the United States made against Libya was very surreptitiously fostered by false intelligence from Israel, done in a way that we thought it came from Libya. So politics are ugly. Nations, basically, are ugly. Any of the divisions of mankind into groups, one of the biggest divisions in history is religion, and there have been more people killed in the name of religion than probably anything else. But what we are not addressing here is the difference between a religion, which is a purely intellectual activity, and spiritual consciousness. And spiritual consciousness means cleansing consciousness of materiality. And spiritual consciousness can cause miraculous things to happen. I wanted to make a little comment about it. A friend sent me an email. You were using the analogy of the pot calling the kettle black. Well, why did the cows go back into the marijuana field? The pot called the cattle back. As I have used this analogy before for politics, left and right and so forth, religion also makes us all roosters in a cockfight. I still look back at ancient Egypt that lasted peacefully and prosperously for 5,000 years. Now imagine this. We're not even 300 years old, and we're falling apart. 5,000 years. One of their goddesses, which of course we would realize is pagan, enunciated principles that Egypt lived by. Her principles became national laws, one of which was always speak the truth to everyone, another of which was always treat everyone in a kindly manner. I haven't seen any nation do that since ancient Egypt. And if we were to do these principles, that brings our consciousness to a much higher level, in my opinion, a much more spiritual level, and makes us all one. If you lied or you treated someone unkindly in ancient Egypt, you violated national law, and you had a problem then. That's why they were so long-lasting, 5,000 years. Let me see if I have anything else to say. Probably don't want to hear it anyway. That's enough.
Next exponent.
I'm not going to talk about rebuttal because I agree with most everything the speaker said. I just wanted to say that my name is Ray Kessler, and I'll be your speaker next week, and I'd like you to bring a copy of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, look those over before you come, because we're going to be looking at some of those texts during the course of the discussion. With regard to our topic tonight, I'm sort of a big fan of the Civil War, and many of you know in the late 1850s and during the war, many of our churches split into northern and southern divisions, especially the Baptist. And the southern divisions of most of these churches spent a lot of time coming up with biblical theories to try to justify why slavery was justified. Come up with lots of theories as to why blacks were inferior, such as that they were the cursed sons of Ham. And if you still look around today on the web, you will find groups that still say that blacks and Jews are the spawn of Satan. So a lot of these problems that are generated by religion are not historical. They are still current. There are still some people who believe in those things.
Yeah, Jim's going to comment. Very rarely he does, sir.
Well, as I've told Tom, I know I have opportunity to speak. I'm so glad that you come and you speak. And in my life, I've had a lot of opportunity to do it. And so I don't have any real big pent-up demand. But I'll say a couple of things about our presentation tonight. Our speaker is giving me a ride home, so I can't be too nasty to him. I'm pretty brave, aren't I?
Okay, time's up.
Oh, yeah. Use the same scriptures out of the Old Testament, even far back in the Old Testament. It doesn't have much to do with Christianity. I've never heard those scriptures quoted over a Baptist, a Presbyterian, or any of the other many churches. Being part of a musical group, I went around to all kinds of churches. So my church background is probably more diverse than vanilla. You know, I'm not a lifelong Southern Baptist or Southern Presbyterian. So those are really not thought of in Christianity very much, just like a lot of other things were left behind in the Old Testament as practices of the old culture that existed at that time. You go into the New Testaments and you read the teachings of Christ, there's a lot of those ideas and thoughts you don't find there. The lack of religious statements in the Constitution. There were 2 or 3 atheists, there were several agnostics. There was a mixture of people who were involved in writing the Constitution. I went and bought a 500-page book that has the writings of all those people. And I can assure you that they had religious thoughts in what they were doing. What they did not want to have was a Church of America like they had in the Church of England. They carved it out. They wanted the government to be totally separate from the church. So they brought really nothing from the church into the Constitution. Did they have religious thoughts when they were putting it together? You can think whatever you want to think, but I've read their writings, and I would say, yes, those who were religious at the time did have religious thoughts when they were writing the Constitution. When you read the comments that went back and forth between them, you'd have to be another fool to not see that. The number of Muslims. We were given the number who are active, radical Islamists. That don't count the inactive ones. So what you find when you look at the surveys, and I've looked at a number of them, there's a much larger percentage, and quite a few of them are here in the United States, who I would call passive radical Islamists. In other words, they're sitting on the sideline right now. They're not going to go out and commit acts, but if that 1% we have here got up to be 10% or 8%, and they decided to carve off colonies inside the country and become more active like they are in England and in Holland and in France and are going to be in Germany, then their attitudes would come out of the woodwork. I have many Islamist friends. Some of them were educators. One's a native of Tehran. He can't even take his family home because if they all go together, he knows he has family members who will kidnap them. They'll never come back. They may not live. So that part of Islam is there. Our speaker 2 weeks ago, who I didn't say a word to, denied that there's any radical thoughts or dangerous bad thoughts inside Islam. And I'm sorry. I have friends who are Syrians and friends who are Iranians and from the different parts of the Middle East, and that's simply not true. Religion does cause a lot of problems in the world. Our speaker is absolutely correct. There are 80 or 90 denominations within the Christian Protestant church, plus the Catholic church, and they're not all exactly the same. And the Jewish group is broken down into 3 big pieces and a lot of small pieces. So we are very diverse in our thinking. It becomes a real challenge for any of us to put a single label on, quote, a group, when it's really multiple groups who are on multiple channels and they're not all marching to the same drummer. So I thank our speaker because unlike a lot of people who get up and speak in front of the group, they don't lay all the true thoughts up here in front of us. I believe our speaker tonight does. I give him full credit for that. We know exactly what he thinks. And whether we agree with all of it or not is our own personal choice. But I appreciate his candor, and I appreciate him telling us exactly what he thinks and why he thinks it. We can also do the same thing. And we're very diverse in this group, but we're not all on the same channel. And thank goodness for that. Makes it a fun group, don't it?
There's a time for a couple more speakers after the lady in yellow.
Well, thank you for a wonderful discussion. Thank you for
Pull the
coming out.
mics down.
Thank you for coming out this evening. I do not believe the problem is Islam. You all that were here the week when we had the other speaker, you probably know I feel that way. I believe that it's an imbalance that we have in human nature with wanting privilege, wanting choice. And we want privilege, but with privilege comes responsibility, and we have always been out of balance in that respect. And one way that that manifests itself is sometimes we have a need to impose our will and our beliefs on others. If we look back just how humanity has started from what scientists believe they have found, Let's look at the way we were in caves. We've had the people that under a certain alignment of stars would pitch their dead in the pit. And this is the village. This is what these people in the village did. They chanted under the stars. They picked the right stars. They attended to what were gruntings and groanings of what would evolve to be spiritual things. We had the people carving the wheels and doing the agriculture, and then we had the guys that hunted and protected it and made these decisions. Have you seen a chessboard with the castle and the bishop and the castle and the church and the castle and the church? We're wanting to impose our will on other people, but we don't really want to take responsibility. And that's another form of it manifesting itself, which is blame. Can we see things in current events to where we could blame? We can look at the news, we can say, oh, well, it's the Islamists. Oh, well, it's this political party, they've done this. Oh, well, it's this political party, they've done this. It's this religion, it's that religion. I actually believe that a lot of faiths are based on very good principles. We do the right thing. We like to believe that somebody is watching us, somebody cares about us, that we might have a little bit more than we see right now and have a motivation to treat each other decently. Take example for the Buddhist faith. Be good. Buddha is watching you. I myself, not so much indoctrinated, but was told and do agree that these things are all essentially good. And we are always going to have groups of people that disagree with one another and try to find ways to validate those opinions, to impose their will on others. And we've got to remember that we're not always going to be balanced in that respect of wanting privilege and responsibility. But this is about blame. And I don't think that the Islamic people are to blame. That's all I've got on that. Thank you.
You gotta bear with me for a second. I didn't have a pencil, so I tried to put all this into my, whatever you call this thing.
Infernal frustrator.
Oh, this is terrible. I can't find it. Oh, okay. Oh my gosh, I can't find it anymore. Well, let me tell you what I can remember. I really am concerned about Sharia. I know that I have a good friend who's got his PhD in chemistry, and I asked him about Sharia, and he said, well, if cutting off hands and stoning people is part of Sharia, he said, then I have to go along with it. But he said, it doesn't happen very often. So then I talked to another fellow who was an engineer, and he said that, if it's part of Sharia, then you have to go all the way. And so it really concerns me that. Another thing is, when somebody compares what's going on today with what went on in the times when Deuteronomy was being written, you just can't do that. I mean, there is a New Testament, there's a New Covenant. You can't say, well, the Hebrews did this back 4,000 years ago, so this is, what's happening today is no different. It is different. This is, we're a lot older and a lot smarter than the people were back, in those ancient times. Oh, gee, I had about 6 things I wanted to mention, but I can't remember them. So those were really the most important. Oh yeah, one other thing I wanted to mention was, when you talk about Christianity and you talk about
belief in things that are impossible and things like that. I mean, there is a progressive movement going on right now, and as large as the Methodist Church is, almost all the seminaries are espousing the concepts of the progressive movement. Things like the virgin birth, substitutionary atonement, for example, where Christ died, took our sins on his shoulders, and died in our place. The progressives really don't believe in those things anymore. They don't believe in original sin. They believe in such unbelievable things as no religion is really wrong, that every religion is a pathway to heaven, that if the Indians talk about the Great Spirit, then what is the difference between Yahweh and the Great Spirit? So, anyway, I think those are the things that I wanted to mention.
I want to thank the speaker for not condemning Islam, because that is the problem. That the bottom line is that I call it the bushwhacker personality disorder. If I perceive I have 51% of the power, I take it all. And so it really has more to do with the fact that we all have an id, and we all have a sociopathic part of ourselves. And when that part of us takes over, then we try to take over other people. And so it's not one common area, it's inside of all of us.
Make it quick, sir.
John.
Well, I must say that after hearing you 2 times, I finally came across one thing that I think we could agree upon, and that is that we should be seeking guidance from the leadership in the Islamic community as to who are the violent people and who are the not violent people. And if I understood you correctly, you agreed to that. Is that right? One of the many things that distresses me about our so-called political and social leaders is that I can't recall anyone going back at least 15 years who has proposed that, unless maybe they're doing it in private and not broadcasting it. So that's the good point. Now, the not so good point. The title says Islam is not the problem. I feel like we were misled. It seemed like most of your presentation was a tirade against Christianity, and the mushy moderates from the shrub part of the Republican Party, and which we also might agree upon. But next time, if you're going to engage in a detailed diatribe, it would be appreciated if you could send that around ahead of time so we could prepare a response to that. I think I could probably spend as much time up here as you spent presenting it, responding and rebutting to it if I had it in front of me, but I don't. Now, there's another thing we might agree upon. You said that you rely upon science when you tried to, but I think you were trying to set up a false dichotomy that religion and science and neither the twain shall meet. Do you recall that many of the leading scientists in the world were devout Christians? Isaac Watt, Mr. Newton, Nikola Tesla. If it wasn't for Nikola Tesla, we wouldn't have lights. He was the fellow who invented alternating current as opposed to direct current. Michael Faraday was another experimenter who was a devout Christian, to which we owe a lot. Now, these are people out of the past. Now, out of the present, well, there's one of the out of the past. J.P. Laplace, French mathematician and physicist. He was also a very devout and committed Christian, and he is the fellow that came up with the idea that there is a God-shaped void inside of each human being, whether we are a Christian or a non-Christian. It was G.K. Chesterton, a literary man from England, who said that if you don't fill the void with Christianity, you don't have nothing. You become susceptible to anything. These are pretty smart guys. Now, as far as current scientists are concerned, there also are quite a few. I just looked here on my little YouTube on this, whatever this thing is, and put in atheist, and there are dozens and dozens of people who are scientists, who converted to Christianity, who are Muslim. Have you ever looked at that? Try going to YouTube and put that in. I was astonished. This is the first time I ever done it. But here are 3 names you might want to consider. You do know who Anthony Flew is, don't you? Sir Anthony Flew? Pardon?
Spell it, please.
F-L-E-W, I believe. Is that right, John? Flew? Well,
I'm not familiar with it.
he has been the leading philosophical atheist of the 20th century. He just made a conversion to Christianity, and he's on here giving his testimony saying why. Here's another man I know most of us don't know. His name is Dr. Francis Collins. He is the director of the Human Genome Project. Now that's a scientist, isn't he? His testimony is on here why he converted from Christianity, from atheism to Christianity. And here's another fellow. This is Bernard Nathanson, MD. Now, this is a man that's maybe a little bit dated here. He wrote a book called Aborting America. He was an abortionist in the state of New York and presided over by his own recognition, his own acknowledgement, 50,000 abortions. But he said that he came to a belief in Christianity, the God creator of the universe, Yahweh, and his son, Jesus Christ. These might be interesting for you guys to look at who believe in that Christianity is an anachronism and science contradicts Christianity. Leading scientists use their profession, leads them to belief in Christianity. There also are a bunch of conversions on here of Muslims converting to Christianity. Slavery was abolished principally and solely because of Christians. Going back to England, Mr. William Pitt the Younger, wasn't he a prime minister, John? And William Wilberforce, they were some of the leaders in the early abolition in opposition to slavery. It was the scientists in the government and the agnostics who didn't think that black people were equivalent to white people. In the 19th century in this country, the movement was solely related to Christianity. One name that comes up is a man named William Lloyd Garrison, who published a newspaper for more than 30 years before the Civil War. So I just wanted to bring out, these are just a few little things to think about that I think you do set up. You're a smart guy, you're knowledge, you're well learned, but I'm not sure you're looking at all the evidence, which is why I suggest this YouTube thing, and particularly Anthony Flew. I have to take one exception to my good friend and highly regarded Mr. Albert Holman over here when he says that more deaths have occurred because of religion. I don't think that's correct. The 20th century seems to be the world champion in mass murders, and those were principally committed by Vladimir Lenin, Joseph Stalin, and Mao Zedong. And it was pushing the numbers around 200 million. And in one closing thing, the phrase you used, friends close and enemies closer, you know where that comes from?
I can't recall.
That's a proverb out of the book of Proverbs. So even you guys that are atheists tend to use the Bible. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Well, we are winding down. If you will listen to me just for these minutes, I'll try to make it fast. I agree with him. I'm disappointed that what we heard was Stephen's cookie cutter, rubber stamp tirade on Christianity, and a lot more of that than what we thought we were going to hear about Islam. I will be glad to give you a service here, the history of Islam, some history in just a very few minutes. Got your pen, paper? Here we go. Muhammad was born about 570, and around 610 he got a vision and a revelation. From then on, just about any and everything he did was because of a revelation and somebody told him to do it. At 622, he just was sort of run out of Mecca, and he went up to Medina. And this is the beginning of the Islamic year, 622. And when he had conquered Medina with all of his forces, he came back to Mecca and he conquered it. Muhammad died in 632. His followers then began going up into, I'm going to call modern day names, to Turkey. They conquered what had been completely Christian Turkey, and also the Palestine area. Then they swept across Christian North Africa, Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, Algeria, all the way on up into Spain. They conquered Spain. They stayed in Spain for 800 years. But during that time of getting into Spain, they started going into Europe, the western part of Europe, scared everybody to death. They mounted a massive opposition to Islam and pushed them back into Spain. That was 732, 100 years after Muhammad died. In eastern Turkey, in about the year 1095, Islam was marching toward Christian Constantinople. They were going to take it, they would usurp it, they would kill the people, and they would make Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul, Muslim. The people in Constantinople were scared to death. They hollered for help to the west. The Pope heard them. And the Pope mounted the First Crusade. The First Crusaders came in and they pushed Islam away from Constantinople to preserve it, and they also kind of purified Palestine. Okay? But they were not through now. In 1453, Islam conquered Constantinople. It was a bloodbath. But then Constantinople and all of Turkey was completely, solidly Muslim. They were not through. By force, they went up into the Balkan Peninsula. They went into Hungary, another bloodbath of a battle there that Islam won. Then they went to the very gates of Vienna, at Vienna in 1529. And again, Western Europe mounted every imaginable force they could, and they pushed back Islam from Vienna. It was the barbarians at the gate. Heard that expression? But they were not through. They were not through. In 1683, they did it again. The gates of Vienna, pounding, 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 and it was all Europe could do to push them back, but they finally pushed them back. Now, the agenda for conquering nations, my friends, hasn't been changed. There is no change. By force, you conquer cities. You subjugate the people. You force Sharia law on them. Nothing has changed. This is the agenda. This is the goal of Islam in the broad spectrum. Nothing has changed. Now they are being invited into Europe against the will of most Europeans. They are rebelling. And they are coming here because our elitists think that we ought to have a lot of them against the will of most of the people. We need to think. That is some history of Islam. It is conquer and subjugate. And the goal hasn't changed. Thank you.
Thanks, Ray. Well, that wraps it up for tonight because we have to wrap it up and get our Jim back home and stuff. Thanks. Your thoughts can be expressed next week, okay? Oh yeah, you get one last word. Be quick though.
Thank you and good night. No, just kidding. As always, it's very hard to respond to such a diverse, number of comments that have come up here. I'll just say that I want to thank Ray for actually helping me make my point that religion has been the cause of a great deal of discord over the centuries. Also want to point out that just because some scientists believe in God doesn't make God real. What makes something real is whether or not there's evidence for it. Also, a lot of the early scientists lived before Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin himself was an agnostic. Thomas Huxley was an agnostic. Albert Einstein did not believe in a personal God. Carl Sagan did not believe in a personal God. Stephen Hawking does not believe in God. These are names I'm sure are familiar to you. And of course, the famous Richard Dawkins, the evolutionary biologist. And there are many, many others. So whether or not a scientist believes in God or not really is beside the point. The point I was trying to make tonight is that what we are too often doing on this planet, and this is the only planet we have, and we're unlikely to find another one habitable for quite a long time. So we better take care of it. We better take care of each other. And as long as we keep squabbling with each other over these things that really don't have any basis in reality, we're just setting ourselves up for disaster. We need to stop doing this. We need to start recognizing our common humanity. We don't have to be Jews, Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, Hindus, whatever. We need to just be people, inhabitants of the planet Earth. We need to recognize that we have problems. We have overpopulation. We have finite resources. We're going to have a lot of problems because of things like that. And perhaps climate change is going to force us to change how we do things. We really need to get on board with some real pressing problems instead of killing one another and fighting with one another over things that aren't even real. I don't believe that there's anything beyond this world other than this life. This is the only one we've got. This is the only planet we've got. There is no such thing as spirituality. People might say, use the word spirituality. There is no spirit world. There is no supernatural. There's only this. This is it. We better take care of it. That's all I've got to say about that.
Thanks, Rick. Thanks, Steve. Joel. Now we got Jim Home.
Gotta get Jim home.
And it may be connected to
even he knows that they shouldn't allow them.
We're absolutely nothing. We're not even grains of sand. But it's
so what do you think?
It's
they just know.
Yeah, it is. I figure out how to turn this thing off.
Thank you.